Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 103rd deck and it's titled Druidic Rituals. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So very quickly, before we get into the deck tech itself, I do want to take a second to highlight some of our social media accounts, some ways you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. And of course, if none of these things appeal to you, you can always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That really helps out a lot. I really do appreciate it. But if you're looking to support us in other ways as well, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. Those are all great ways to reach out. If you ever have any questions, if you have any cards that you would like to see turned into decks for this channel, those are the best ways to get those information across to me. And then finally, if you're interested in supporting us a little bit in other ways, you can find us over on TCG Player using the affiliate link in the description of this video. Once you've clicked on that, any cards you purchase on their website, we get a little bit of a kickback from, just kind of as a thank you. And then the most direct way that you can help support us is Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Once you're over there, you get access to a ton of different stuff. You get access to stuff like the deck lists an entire week early. You get to be a part of a Discord channel where we actually brew up the decks and also record some of the videos. So if you've ever wanted to be in some of the games, that's a great way to do it. There's also the ability to get the unedited gameplay videos, where I will show you the whole uncut videos so you can hear all the players talking and interacting and having a good time rather than just my narration over a shortened version of it. You'll also get a random card sent to you every single month as a thank you for all of your support. And probably the most entertaining of all of the things you can get is that because we do so many requests on this channel, I can't promise to turn any request into a video for anyone except our patrons. So if you have a card that you really want to see turned into a video, that is the best way to do it. And of course, before we move on, we do have to highlight our 5 current patrons. We do have William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Huey, and Jeff Winger. To the 5 of you, thank you all so much for all that you do. And without any further ado, let's jump into our deck tech. So first up, we got to talk about our random card of the week, which was suggested to us over by D17381 over on Reddit. And that card is going to be Gilt-Leaf Archdruid. Now, Gilt-Leaf Archdruid is a card that I personally have been a big fan of for a long time, but never could quite find a way to make it work. So I was very excited to see this recommendation. But Gilt-Leaf Archdruid is 3 green for a 3/3 elf druid. Whenever you play a druid spell, you may draw a card and tap 7 untapped druids you control, gain control of all lands target player controls. So right away, it's important to mention that there are not many cards in Magic that actually care about druids. This is actually, as far as I'm aware, one of only 2 cards that actively care about druids in a way that makes us want to play a ton of druids. I know there are some cards that kind of do special things when there's druids in play, but this is one of the few things that rewards us for playing a ton of druids. And so obviously we have to play a ton of druids. And to make that work, we're playing in the command zone the other card that really cares about druids, which is Seton, Krosan Protector. And Seton, Krosan Protector is green for a 2/2 Centaur Druid Legend. Tap an untapped druid you control, add a green to your mana pool. There's a couple of interesting things that I want to mention before we actually move on to our themes of this deck. First off, Gilt-Leaf Archdruid, probably going to draw a little bit of hate. You could steal lands. People don't really like that. So be aware of that if you ever just cast it for the value of drawing cards. And then Seton, the way that its ability is worded is actually incredibly important to how this deck functions, because Seton does not have a tap ability. It doesn't give our other druids a tap ability. We can just tap them to make that mana, meaning that it doesn't matter if they have summoning sickness or not, they can tap right away for a green mana because that's just the cost to activate Seton's ability. So if we cast Seton for 3 mana on turn 3, we can still tap Seton himself, because he is an untapped druid, to make a green mana to play something else. So that is incredibly relevant because with so many druids in this deck, it's incredibly easy to curve out and just start playing more and more druids every single turn as the druids start to pay for themselves. So obviously with that in mind, let's take a quick look at some of our themes. The first one we've talked a little bit about already, that is druids. Like I said, we don't have a great number of druids in the deck that actually care about other druids, but there's enough in here that we can play around with some cool cards that really don't see a ton of play otherwise. And a good example of that, at least in my opinion, because I've never seen this card cast, obviously people agree with me given its $6 price tag, is Druid of Purification, which is 3 and a green for a 2/3 human druid. When Druid of Purification enters the battlefield, starting with you, each player may choose an artifact or enchantment you don't control. Destroy each chosen permanent this way. So essentially, this is bare minimum going to be destroying one thing because we can choose that one thing, but it will most likely destroy at least 3 things, usually 4, because all we've got to do, we pick one thing, the next opponent picks something else, third opponent, fourth opponent. If 2 people choose the same permanent, obviously it's still destroyed and there's less value to be had from it, but the odds of everyone kind of choosing the same permanent is very low because for most people, this is just kind of a free destroy whatever they want on the board, whether it's a mana rock or a value enchantment or a value artifact or an equipment, whatever it may be. Druid of Purification is an amazing card, and having played with it a few times now, I wouldn't necessarily say it's worth the $6 price tag, but it is very, very powerful, and it's a good example of what our druids want to do because it's coming in, it's immediately doing something, and then we can actually tap it to make mana. So that is our first theme, just playing very good druids. And then our second theme is because most of our druids actually wind up being elves, we also have a bit of an elf sub-theme as well. And a good example of that is Elvish Archdruid, which is 1 green for a 2/2 elf druid. Other elf creatures you control get +1/+1. Tap, add a green for each elf you control. Now obviously Druid of Purification is not an elf, Seton, not an elf, but Elvish Archdruid, Gilt-Leaf Archdruid are both elves. We have a lot of elves in this deck. It's really surprising when I put this deck together how many creatures were elf druids. Like I said, there's obviously other things that aren't elves, but because of the huge overlap, it just makes sense to play an elf sub-theme because we're just running the elves anyway. We might as well benefit from it, and Elvish Archdruid is a great way to pump up most of the team and also make us a bunch of mana. So that leads us then, finally, to our third and last theme of the deck, and that is going to be mana sinks. Because our commander basically lets all of our creatures tap for mana, and some of our creatures, like Elvish Archdruid, tap for mana on their own, we need to find a way to make use of that mana. It won't do us any good to run out a bunch of creatures, have no cards in hand, they get board wiped away, and then we're just kind of stuck. So that's where cards like Staff of Domination come into play, because it's 3 mana for an artifact. You can pay 1 to untap it, pay 2, tap it, gain a life. Pay 3, tap it, untap target creature. Pay 4, tap it, tap target creature. Pay 5, tap, draw a card. Now, Staff of Domination is pretty notorious for being an infinite combo engine. It actually can go infinite just with Elvish Archdruid here, because as long as Elvish Archdruid is tapping for more than 3 mana, so a bare minimum of 4, we can pay 3 to Staff of Domination to untap Elvish Archdruid. Elvish Archdruid then pays 4, 1 to untap the staff, 3 to untap the Archdruid. So as long as we can generate more than that, we can go infinite, make an infinite amount of green mana, which can then be sunk into Staff of Domination to draw cards, tap down all of our opponent's creatures, gain an infinite amount of life, whatever you gotta do. It's not necessarily in here to be an infinite combo piece, but it is a great way to make use of that if that's something that happens. But even if we don't go fully infinite, we just generate, say, 15 mana, it's nice to be able to draw 2 cards, untap it, gain a bunch of life, maybe tap down a blocker. It's a great way to sink in a ton of mana that we're not going to be able to use otherwise. And we have other cards in the deck that fulfill a very similar function. But those are our themes for this deck. The next thing that we're going to have to do is, of course, talk about some key cards. These are the cards that are really win conditions. They're huge value pieces. These are the things that our deck really wants to be able to function in the way that's going to help us win the game. And the first of those key cards is going to be Augur of Autumn. Every time I see this card, it really puts in so much work, and I've never seen it cast and not do at least something. So Augur of Autumn is 1 green for a 2/3 human druid. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play lands from the top of your library, and as long as you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you may cast creature spells from the top of your library. So at a bare minimum, Augur of Autumn is letting us play lands from the top of our library to make sure that we don't actually draw them. We can draw something else, at least hopefully. We might have a ton of lands on top. If that's the case, then we're just kind of stuck. But it also means that if we have at least 3 creatures with 3 different powers, which is not hard to accomplish in this deck because we have a ton of 1, 2, and 3 power creatures, then we can not only play the lands from the top of our deck, but cast the creatures from the top of our deck as well, meaning that we have another, not necessarily mana sink for all of our creatures that are making mana, but it's a great way to use a little extra of that mana. Maybe get a couple of creatures off the top, play a land, maybe a couple more creatures. And then again with Seton, we're able to play a creature off the top. It immediately can tap for mana, maybe cast the next creature, and kind of keep the train rolling to the point where we can fill up the board very, very quickly in a very unexpected way. So that if our opponent doesn't have a board wipe, we can just kind of steamroll as soon as we untap on our next turn. But that is our first key card. Our next key card is going to be Wrap in Vigor. There's not a ton of ways to protect an entire board of creatures in mono green for cheap. I mean, yes, Heroic Intervention will do it, but that's $15. We don't exactly have $15 to spend on a card. So instead, we're playing Wrap in Vigor, which is 1 and a green for an instant. Regenerate each creature you control. Simple, very easy. And the nice thing, again, going back to Seton, is that because our creatures can tap for mana as soon as we play them, we don't have to be afraid to tap out. We can just tap all of our lands, play some creatures, and maybe we leave just 2 creatures untapped, and those 2 creatures can tap for Wrap in Vigor to protect our entire board. And yeah, it won't protect us from like -X/-X, it won't protect from exile, but just being able to protect from something that destroys all creatures can put us in a huge advantageous position because now we get to untap, we have way more mana than our opponents, we have way more creatures than our opponents, and we can kind of just start to run the game at that point. So Wrap in Vigor is a great protection spell, and it really deserves a slot in our key cards here, mainly just for keeping us alive. And then, of course, we do have to talk about our last key card, which is going to be Kindred Summons. Kindred Summons usually puts in a lot of work in creature-focused decks, especially creature-focused decks that are just 1 creature type. But in this deck, it really works a little bit into overtime, because Kindred Summons is 5 green for an instant. Choose a creature type, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards of the chosen type, where X is the number of creatures you control of that type. Put those cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest of the revealed cards into your library. Most of the time, with Kindred Summons, we're going to be getting at least 3 creatures, most likely upwards of 5 to 6 creatures just by casting Kindred Summons. And because it's an instant, we get those creatures at the end of our opponent's turn before we untap, and even if for some reason our opponents have some instant speed removal, we've just put 5 to 7 creatures into play. They can now tap for mana because of Seton. We can cast Wrap in Vigor to protect ourselves. We can cast some other protection spells that we may need. So Kindred Summons really takes the deck from 0 to 100 incredibly quickly, because we might only have 5 little 1/1 mana dorks in play that we then turn into 10 absolutely massive creatures because they're finding ways to pump each other up. We might find overrun effects to pump up the entire team, give them trample. It can become a threat really and literally out of nowhere. So Kindred Summons, very worth an inclusion on this list as a key card, and definitely earns its spot in the deck as a whole. So that is the end of our key cards. The next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some cool interactions, and these are cards that synergize very well together and just kind of help push us toward a victory in the end. And the first pair of cards that I want to highlight are going to be Circle of Dreams Druid and Umbral Mantle. So we talked a little bit earlier about how Eldritch Archdruid can go infinite with some untapped shenanigans. This is literally just another one of those combos that I felt was important to mention because Circle of Dreams Druid is very similar to Elvish Archdruid, but is just slightly better because it is green, green, green for a 2/1 Elf Druid that taps for a green mana for each creature you control. So on its own, it taps for 1 green mana because we control 1 creature, but it also can tap for much, much more. And this one triggers on humans, on centaurs, it doesn't matter, it doesn't just have to be elves. So if we combine that up with Umbral Mantle, which is 3 mana for an equipment, equipped creature has pay 3 and untap. This creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, equip for 0. All we now have to do is make sure that Circle of Dreams Druid is making 4+ mana and goes infinite with Umbral Mantle, making an infinite amount of green mana. Now, admittedly, this isn't quite as infinite as with the Staff of Domination because that can draw cards, that can tap creatures, gain life. This one literally just makes mana, but that is okay because as we're doing this, Circle of Dreams Druid is getting +2/+2, and it's not out of the ordinary that we just make it infinitely large and hit someone and knock them out of the game, find ways to make it unblockable, maybe give it trample. So Umbral Mantle on its own doesn't technically win the game, but getting infinite mana in this deck is pretty close to just winning the game. So that is one great way to do it. That's one cool interaction. And of course, we got to talk about another cool interaction, this one between Kamahl, Heart of Krosa, and Eudora, Grave Gardener. So Kamahl, Heart of Krosa is 6 green green for a 5/5 legendary creature human druid. At the beginning of combat on your turn, creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. You can pay 1 and a green until end of turn. Target land you control becomes a 1/1 elemental creature with vigilance, indestructible, and haste. It's still a land. Then we can partner that up with Eudora, Grave Gardener, which is 4 and a green for a legendary creature, Treefolk Druid, 5/5. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may return it to the battlefield face down under its owner's control. It's a forest land. So the reason that these two, I think, synergize so well together is because if we have an army of creatures that are getting +3/+3 with Kamahl, we send them into combat, maybe some of them die, they now return to the battlefield with Eudora as forests, and Kamahl can turn those forests into 1/1 elementals with vigilance, indestructible, and haste, then give them +3/+3 when he goes to combat, meaning we can kind of keep our entire board even if someone has the ability to destroy them in combat. Plus, and this is a very unique situation, if somehow the lands that Kamahl has turned into creatures were to die, Eudora doesn't care that they're forests. They're just non-token creatures. They would then return to the battlefield face down as forests. It's very unlikely that those creatures die because they do have indestructible, but it is worth noting that if somehow they were to die, Eudora will return them as forests, so it's really like nothing at all happened. We just got to attack kind of for free. So a very cool interaction, a very niche interaction, but still something I wanted to highlight, especially because both of these cards are just phenomenal in this deck as it is. They're both druids. They both really help us with what we want to do, whether it's pumping up the team with Kamahl or protecting us from board wipes and helping us ramp with Eudora. Just overall, an awesome pair of cards that, again, very great on their own, but synergize very well together. But that finally brings us to the end of our deck tech, where we do have to talk a little bit about the price of the deck. And as you know, our budget is $100. This week we came in at $97.48, which was very close to our budget limit. And a good portion of that price actually comes from Helix Pinnacle. Helix Pinnacle is a green mana for an enchantment. It has Shroud. You can pay X, put X tower counters on Helix Pinnacle at the beginning of your upkeep. If there are 100 or more tower counters on Helix Pinnacle, you win the game. So this is just an extra way to try to win the game. Maybe we can't get through with combat. Maybe our creatures just can't quite get there. But because we're going to generate so much mana in this deck, it's important to have a win condition that isn't necessarily going to be with our creatures. So this is a great way to make sure that we're kind of storing up counters if we need to, or if we manage to make infinite mana with one of the many infinite mana generation combos, we can just kind of win the game at the end of our opponent's turn, put 100 counters on it, go to our upkeep, win the game. And because Helix Pinnacle has Shroud, it is incredibly difficult for our opponents to get rid of because they need mass enchantment removal, which is very difficult to come by. So Helix Pinnacle is most likely going to be on the board for the entire game, but it is also worth mentioning that it will draw a ton of eyes because any card that says you win the game on it, people are going to take notice of. So that is something to pay attention to if you decide to play this card. However, it is about $6.42, so if you did need to trim the price of the deck down closer to about $91, this is a card you can cut for budget purposes. On the other hand, though, if you're looking to actually increase the price of the deck, I do have one out-of-budget upgrade that I would recommend for you, and in this case, it's going to be Awaken the Woods. So Awaken the Woods is X green, sorcery, create X 1/1 green forest dryad land creature tokens. Notably, not druids, they are dryads, those are different things, but this is essentially another great mana sink for this deck because we can make, say, 15 mana, we sink it into Awaken the Woods, we make 13 1/1s that also tap for a green mana, letting us in our next turn just go absolutely crazy with a ton of mana, and they are still 1/1 creatures, so if we can find a way to pump things up, maybe with something like Kamal, we can use this as a win condition in more ways than just making the mana. Unfortunately, this is a $17 card, so it definitely does not fit into our $100 budget. However, if you did want to include it, the card I would recommend taking out is actually Boreal Druid, and it looks a little bit weird to recommend taking out a 1-mana mana dork because it's literally just a green mana for a 1/1 elf druid that taps to add 1 to your mana pool. But the main reason I would recommend it is we have quite a few 1/1 mana dorks as it is. Making a colorless mana really isn't helpful for us because a lot of our creatures have 1, 2, or 3 green mana in their casting costs. So making 1 additional mana is not actually as useful as it sounds when it's colorless. Plus, it also is a snow creature, which I imagine is why its price is so high compared to some of the other 1-mana mana dorks. And we have no snow synergies, so there's no real reason to keep this in here if you can replace it with something as strong as Awaken the Woods. But that is our out-of-budget upgrade section. That is the only upgrade I've got suggested for you. And so the next thing we have to do is, of course, see how this deck performs in a game. And not just one game this week. We are going to play this deck in 2 separate games. And I will explain why in just a few minutes. But the first game we're going to play is going to be against Mike, AngryCow, and Bilal. Mike is playing his Tasha the Witch Queen deck, which he has been slowly fine-tuning. We've seen it show up a couple of times on this channel. If you haven't seen this before, Mike has his own Twitch channel where he actually made the deck with a lot of his viewers and then has slowly been working to improve it since then. So I will put a link to his Twitch channel in the description of the video. If you're interested, do go check him out. He's great. He does a ton of magic stuff and fighting content. Not him fighting, like fighting game content. And then also a ton of art stuff. So very, very cool. In this case, his Tasha the Witch Queen deck is kind of like a Dimir trade binder kind of deck. He just took all the best Dimir cards he owned, stuck them into a deck, and kind of hoped for the best. And over time, it's grown into a little bit more of a controlling deck, a little bit more of a steal your stuff kind of a deck. So a very cool deck to see go off. Although, if I'm being perfectly honest, being mono green up against a control deck is not right where we want to be. So I am a little bit worried about this one. Next up is Cow's Nimrus Una's Trickster deck, and this one he said that was kind of functioning on a similar level to the decks that we make for the channel, where he found one card, built around it, and then decided to do the best that he could with that one card, with other random things he had laying around, mostly on a budget, but there is one card in particular that breaks the budget. I'm pretty sure it's Otawara, the Soaring City. So for the most part, though, this Nimrus deck is just a flash deck, so he wants to play things on his opponent's turn, make sure that he's getting value that way, and then kind of slowly grind out the victory because he's going to have a lot more information than the rest of us. And I think if I have to pick a deck that I'm the most concerned about, I think it's probably the Nimrus deck because I've played multiple flash decks in the past, including a Nimrus deck especially, and there's just something about having more information than your opponents that really changes the game. So I think that alone kind of pushes Nimrus to the top and makes them the most concerning deck at the table. And then finally, we have Bilal's Jetmir Nexus of Revels deck. This is just a Naya token style, so he wants to get a ton of small tokens, make them super big with Jetmir, give them Vigilance, give them Trample, give them Double Strike, and just find ways to run his opponents over by just going significantly wider than anyone could possibly block. So definitely looking forward to this. I haven't actually played against a Jetmir deck, but I am very interested in the commander himself, so I'm very excited to see how it turns out. Like I mentioned though, this is just game 1. You'll see why as we kind of transition into the game and start talking about it, but I hope you do enjoy the video. I hope you have enjoyed the deck tech so far. Hope you enjoy the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Mike, Cow, and then Bilal. On my first turn, I play a forest. Mike plays a bad river. Cow plays a contaminated aquifer. Bilal plays a jungle shrine. Unfortunately, on my turn though, I miss my second land drop and pass. Mike sacrifices his bad river to search his library for a watery grave, paying 2 life so it comes into play untapped. Then he plays a Dark Slick Shores and casts Arcane Signet. Cow plays a Sunken Hollow. Bilal plays an Exotic Orchard. I draw for my turn, and still with no second land, discard to hand size. Mike plays a Shipwreck Marsh, then casts Phyrexian Arena, drawing an additional card in his upkeep and losing a life. Cow plays an island and casts Jacob Hawken Inspector, which lets him draw a card and exile a card from his hand face down. Bilal plays a mountain and casts Professional Facebreaker, letting him make a treasure whenever one or more of his creatures do combat damage to a player, and also lets him sacrifice a treasure to exile the top card of his library and cast it this turn. On my turn, I miss my second land drop, but I do cast a Fyndhorn Elves. In Mike's upkeep, he draws an additional card and loses a life, then plays a Blast Zone. Cow activates Jacob, drawing a card and exiling a card from his hand, then plays an island. Bilal plays a Plains and attacks Mike for 2, making a treasure token. Then in the second main phase, cast Rabble Rousing, but Mike responds by casting Sudden Substitution, swapping control of the Rabble Rousing while it's on the stack, giving it to me, but giving Bilal control of my Fyndhorn Elves. Then the Rabble Rousing resolves, and I hide away 5. Unfortunately, this means that I once again have to discard to hand size on my turn since I'm still missing my second land. In Mike's upkeep, he draws an additional card and loses a life, then plays a swamp and casts Consecrated Sphinx, letting him draw 2 cards whenever an opponent draws a card, and at the end of turn, Cow casts Stunt Double, having it enter as a copy of Consecrated Sphinx. Then, in Cow's upkeep, he casts Mystic Subdual, enchanting Mike's Consecrated Sphinx, giving it -2/-0 and removing all of its abilities. Then he plays an Otawara Soaring City and attacks Bilal for 4 with his Consecrated Sphinx. Bilal plays a Command Tower and casts Beast Within to destroy Cow's copy of Consecrated Sphinx, but Cow responds by casting Quickling, which returns the stunt double to his hand when it enters. Then Bilal goes to combat, attacking me for 1 with my own Fyndhorn Elves, and Mike for 2 with the Facebreaker, making 2 treasure tokens. In Bilal's second main phase, he casts a Perforos, God of the Forge, doing 2 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters the battlefield under his control. On my turn, I'm still stuck on 1 land, so I just continue to discard to hand size. In Mike's upkeep, he draws an additional card, loses a life, then plays a swamp, and casts Displacer Kitten, letting him exile a non-land permanent he controls and return it to the battlefield whenever he casts a non-creature spell. He moves to combat, attacking Cow for 2, and at the end of turn, Cow activates Jacob, drawing a card and exiling a card from his hand. Cow plays an island and casts Arcane Signet. Bilal plays a mountain and casts Halo Fountain, then attacks me for 1 with the Elves and Mike for 2 with the Facebreaker. Before blocks though, Mike casts Saw in half, destroying his Consecrated Sphinx and creating 2 token copies of it with half the power and toughness. This also triggers Displacer Kitten, letting him exile his Arcane Signet and return it to play. Then he uses the 2 Sphinxes to block the Facebreaker, killing it while I take 1 and Bilal creates a treasure token. However, Bilal also untaps both of his creatures with a Halo Fountain before the damage to draw a card and sacrifice the treasure to exile the top 2 cards of his library before it dies. When I draw for my turn, this triggers the Consecrated Sphinxes, letting Mike draw 4 and Cow draw 2. Then, since they both drew cards, they trigger each other's Consecrated Sphinxes, being able to draw in increments of 2 until either of them deny the trigger. In the end, Mike draws 50 cards while Cow draws 64. Then I can finally pass through my turn since I still haven't found a land, discarding the hand size. In Mike's upkeep, he draws an additional card, losing a life, but Cow declines his draws from Consecrated Sphinx. Mike then plays an island and casts Consuming Aberration, making each opponent mill until they hit a land whenever he casts a spell. He then casts a Soul Ring, making each opponent mill until they hit a land, and also casts Tasha's Hideous Laughter, making each opponent mill until they hit a land, and then exile cards from the top of their deck until they exile 20 or more mana value worth of spells. This also triggers Displacer Kitten, letting Mike exile Arcane Signet and return it to play. After that, he moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 4 with both of his Consecrated Sphinxes, and at the end of turn, Cow flashes in Spectral Sailor, but in response, Mike counters it with Pact of Negation, making each opponent mill until they hit a land and exiling his Soul Ring, returning it to play. This winds out milling Cow's entire library, but he tries to go down swinging in his upkeep. First, he casts Cunning Nightbonder, making all his spells with flash cost 1 less and making them uncounterable. Then he casts Necron Deathmark, destroying Mike's Consuming Aberration and milling him for 3. Unfortunately, that's all Cow's able to do, so when he goes to draw a card for the turn and can't, he gets knocked out of the game. When Bilal draws for his turn, Mike also chooses to draw 2, then Bilal plays a mountain and casts Finale of Glory for X equals 6, attempting to make 6 2/2 soldiers, but Mike once again has the answer, countering it with a Force of Negation, exiling a blue card from his hand so that he can cast it for free. When I draw for my turn, Mike also chooses to draw 2, and then I move straight to discard, missing my second land for the 7th turn in a row. On Mike's turn, he casts Reanimate, returning Agent of Treachery from his graveyard to play, losing 7 life. When it enters, he gains control of Bilal's Perforos, thankfully not taking my only land. Then he casts Siphon Insight, triggering the kitten, exiling the agent, returning it to play, and taking Bilal's Halo Fountain. Then the Insight resolves, letting him look at the top 2 cards of Bilal's library, putting one on the bottom of his deck and exiling the other, being able to cast it at any time. Notably, nobody else should be able to see the cards, but due to the limitations of playing over webcam, we reveal them instead. Mike then casts an Intellect Devourer, making each opponent lose 2 life with Perforos, and making each opponent exile a card from their hand, letting Mike cast them at any time. He moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 6, and then at the end of turn, Mike realizes that he forgot to pay for his Pact of Negation, unfortunately losing him the game. On Bilal's turn, he casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. Then he casts his commander, Jetmir Nexus of Revels, and with a steady threat on board and no other opponents, I finally decide to concede, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so game 1 didn't quite go the way we had anticipated, and I know a lot of people are probably yelling at me for keeping a 1-land hand, but I'm going to play a little bit of a game with you guys where we're going to say keep or mulligan, and I would like to show you my first hand and kind of explain my reasoning on why I kept it and see if maybe you guys would all do the same, whether you would keep this hand or throw the hand away and get something else. So first off, it's important to note that when I drew this hand of 7, this was already my 3rd mulligan. So I was about to go down to 6 cards. So I have to throw one of these cards away, and if I mulligan this hand, I have to go to 5. So I decide to keep this hand of 6, throw away the Collective Unconscious, and hope for the best. My thinking is, if I can hit one more land, I cast Druid of the Cowl, which gets me to Marwyn or Elvish Archdruid, which gets me probably to Beast Whisperer and Freyalise, and then I'm able to just play the game like normal, banking on hitting just one land to be able to unlock the rest of my hand. There was no way I could have possibly predicted that in the top 25 cards of my deck, there was not a single land, and it literally was the top 25. I didn't see it when I did the hideaway. I didn't draw one. I didn't do anything until we eventually had to mill it for the consuming aberration. So definitely unexpected. I don't know what the numbers on that are. I'm sure someone could tell me, but I'm very interested in what everyone else has to think. Is this a hand that you would choose to keep knowing this was your 6, or would you throw it away and go and get a hand of 5? I think that's really the trick to this one, but like I said, I'd love to hear what you have to say, so let me know in the comments if you would keep this hand or mulligan it away. But of course, since we didn't do as hot as I wanted to, the deck literally did nothing. We casted a single Fyndhorn Elves and that was it, and then the Fyndhorn Elves was stolen from us. We're going to play a second game to see if this deck can actually do something worth talking about. And so we actually jumped into a game immediately after that first one ended. So we are still playing with Bilal, with Mike, and with AngryCow in a slightly different turn order this time. So first up, we have AngryCow playing Tetsuo Imperial Champion. We have Mike playing Mael the Anima, and we have Bilal playing Elenda the Dusk Rose. So starting off with Cow's Tetsuo deck, just like last time with Jetmir, this is a deck that I have not seen before, so I am very excited to see how Tetsuo works out. I'm not 100% sure what the big payoffs are going to be, because I imagine it's a lot of splitting your focus between equipment and instants and sorceries, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to work out, but I am very excited to see it because I think Tetsuo could be a ton of fun. Next up, we have Mike and his Mael the Anima deck. This is a deck that has also shown up on this channel before. Mike's Mael deck is really just full of big, stompy creatures. He just wants to power out a bunch of big boys and just start swinging as soon as possible. So I don't think I'm too concerned about this deck because I think we're going to be able to outpace him and put more creatures on board, even if they're smaller. So we'll see how that one goes. And then finally, we have Bilal's Elenda the Dusk Rose deck. This is probably the deck that I'm the most concerned about at the table, because really all he wants to do is make a ton of tokens, sacrifice a bunch of tokens, and just create a ton of counters for Elenda, which can then be sacrificed and make a ton of tokens. So it's very aristocrat style, and I think we're going to struggle with that as a whole because we don't have a ton of interactions for sacrificing, for life gain, anything like that. Our really only goal is to make a ton of mana and hit really hard. So hopefully we can get there before Bilal can kind of go off with Elenda, but we'll see how it goes. Hopefully our deck does a little bit better in this game, and I hope you all enjoy it, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, Cow goes first, followed by Mike, myself, and then Bilal. On Cow's first turn, he plays an island. Mike plays a forest. I play a forest and cast Llanowar Elves. Bilal plays a plains. Cow plays an island and casts Chart a Course, drawing 2 cards and discarding a card. Mike plays a mountain. I play a forest and cast Augur of Autumn, letting me look at the top of my library at any time, play it if it's a land, and cast it if it's a creature, as long as I have 3 creatures with different powers. Bilal plays a swamp. Cow plays a Maestro's Theater, which sacrifices itself to let him search his library for a mountain, putting it into play tapped, then he casts Soul Ring. Mike plays a plains and casts his commander Mael the Anima. I play a forest and cast Voice of Many, drawing a card for each opponent who controls fewer creatures than I do, which is all 3 of them. Bilal plays an Orzhov Basilica, returning a swamp to his hand. Cow plays an island and casts Brass Knuckles, creating a copy of it when it enters the battlefield. Mike plays a plains. I play a forest and cast my commander Seton, Krosan Protector, being able to tap a druid to make a green mana. This allows me to cast Marwyn the Nurturer, which taps for mana equal to her power and gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an elf enters under my control. After that, I cast Druid Lyrist, followed up by casting a Fyndhorn Elves, which does put a counter on Marwyn. Finally, I cast Vivien, Champion of the Wilds, letting me cast creatures at instant speed. I activate Vivien's -2 ability, looking at the top 3 cards of my library, exiling 1, and being able to cast it if it's a creature. Bilal plays a swamp and casts Meat Hook Massacre for x=2, giving all creatures -2/2, gaining Bilal 5 life since 5 of his opponent's creatures died. Cow casts Valduk, Keeper of the Flame, and equips Valduk with both Brass Knuckles, giving him double strike, and, when he moves to combat, triggers Valduk's ability, creating 2 3/1 elementals with trample and haste since he has 2 equipment attached to Valduk. Then he attacks me for 3 and Vivian for 3, killing the Planeswalker. Finally, at the end of turn, he sacrifices both elementals. On Mike's turn, he casts Green Sun Zenith for x=3, searching his library for a creature with mana value 3 or less, putting it into play. This lets him get Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, which can tap for green mana equal to the greatest power among creatures he controls, and lets any player draw a card when they play a creature with the greatest power. He then attacks Bilal for 2 with Mael. I play a forest and recast my commander Seton, and then move to combat attacking Bilal for 5. Bilal casts Solemn Simulacrum, searching his library for a swamp, putting it into play tapped, then plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1. Cow casts Necropouncer, creating a 0/0 germ token when it enters and then attaching to it, giving the germ +3/+1 and haste. When he goes to combat, he creates 2 elementals with Valduk and then attacks Bilal for 6, Mike for 6, and me for 3. Bilal blocks one of the elementals with Solemn Simulacrum, killing both creatures, drawing a card, gaining a life, making each opponent lose a life, and taking 3 damage, while Mike takes 6 and I also take 3. Mike casts Shalai, Voice of Plenty, giving himself and his other creatures hexproof, then moves to combat attacking Cow for 4. I play a forest from the top of my library, cast a Boreal Druid, and then cast the card I exiled with Vivian, Druid of Purification, letting each player choose an artifact or enchantment controlled by one of my opponents, destroying them. This results in the Meat Hook Massacre, Soul Ring, and one of the Brass Knuckles being destroyed. Once that's resolved, I cast Freyalise Llanowar's Fury, activating her +2 ability to create a Llanowar Elf token. Bilal plays a swamp and casts Phyrexian Plague Lord, drawing a card when it enters since it's the largest creature on the battlefield. Cow re-equips the Necropouncer to Valduk, killing the germ but giving Valduk +3/+1 in haste. When he moves to combat, he makes 2 elementals with Valduk and then attacks Freyalise with everything he's got, so I choose not to block, letting the Planeswalker die. Mike casts Seedborn Muse, letting him untap all of his permanents in each other player's untapped step. I play a forest and cast Kamal, Heart of Krosa, giving all my creatures +3/+3 in trample when I move to combat. Before the trigger resolves though, Mike activates Mael, looking at the top 5 cards of his library and putting a creature with power 4 or greater among them into play, letting him play Terastodon for free, drawing a card, and destroying both of Cow's equipment and his own mountain, replacing them with 3/3 elephant tokens. Then Kamal's trigger resolves, allowing me to attack Mike with my entire board. He blocks the Voice of Many and the Augur, killing the Voice and his elephant token, then he takes 11 total damage. At the end of turn, Bilal casts Archivist of Ogma, letting him draw a card and gain a life whenever an opponent searches their library. On Bilal's turn, he plays a swamp and casts Dauthi Voidwalker, exiling any of his opponent's cards when they go to the graveyard. He also casts Ambition's Cost, drawing 3 cards and losing 3 life, and then also casts Skrelv's Hive, letting him make a 1/1 Might token with Toxic 1 in his upkeep, but also making him lose a life at the same time. Then, at the end of turn, Mike activates Mael again, but Bilal responds by sacrificing his Plague Lord to give the Seedborn Muse -4/-4. Unfortunately, Mike has an answer, casting Bolt Bend to redirect the ability to Kamal, giving him -4/-4 instead. Luckily, he's a 5/5, so he still survives. Then Mael's ability resolves, letting him put an Ancient Copper Dragon into play, which lets him roll a d20 when it deals combat damage to a player, making a number of treasures equal to what he rolls. Unfortunately, on Cow's turn, he can't do anything except pass, letting Mike activate Mael at the end of turn, putting Dragonlord Dramoka into play, preventing his opponents from casting spells or activating abilities on his turn. On Mike's turn, he plays a Plains and attacks Cow with Terastodon, Dromoka, Shalai, and the Copper Dragon. Cow blocks the Terastodon with an Elephant, killing it but only taking 14 total damage, while Mike rolls an 8 on a d20, making 8 treasure tokens. In his second main phase, Mike casts Zakama Primal Calamity, untapping all of his lands when it enters, and also being able to pay 3 mana to do 3 damage to any creature, destroy an artifact or enchantment, or gain 3 life. He also cast Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, exiling Dauthi Voidwalker and Cow's Mountain, and finally he casts Inferno Titan, doing 1 damage to Bilal and my Llanowar Elf and Boreal Druid, killing my creatures. On my turn, I play a Forest, and then cast Pyre of Heroes, letting me sacrifice a creature to search my library for a creature, mana value equal to the sacrificed creature's +1, and put it into play. In response, Mike activates Kama twice to do 6 total damage to Kamal, killing him. Still in response, Mike activates Mael, putting Sigarda Host of Herons into play, making him unable to sacrifice any creatures. Then the Pyre finally resolves, letting me immediately activate it, sacrificing the Druid of Purification to search my library for a Gilt-Leaf Archdruid, putting it into play. This lets me draw a card whenever I cast a Druid, and also lets me tap 7 Druids to gain control of all lands target player controls. Finally, I cast an End-Raze Forerunner, giving all my creatures +2/+2 and trample until the end of turn. Bilal plays a Plains and casts Spirited Companion, drawing a card when it enters. He also casts Skull Clamp, immediately equipping it to the companion, but Mike responds, activating Zakama twice to destroy both of Bilal's creatures. Mike also activates Mael, putting Spearbreaker Behemoth into play, and once that's resolved, Bilal casts a Morbid Opportunist, letting him draw a card once a turn whenever a creature dies, and alongside that, he also casts a Blood Flow Connoisseur. Cow casts a Thieving Skydiver, kicking it to gain control of Bilal's Skull Clamp. He equips the Skull Clamp to his Elephant, giving it +1/-1 and letting him draw 2 cards when it dies, which he immediately does by attacking me and letting me block with the Forerunners. In his second main phase, he plays a Temple of Malice, scrying 1, and at the end of turn, Mike activates Zakama twice, destroying both of Cow's creatures, and also activates Mael, putting Blightsteel Colossus into play. Mike plays a Plains, and activates Zakama twice to destroy both of Bilal's blockers, drawing him a card, and also activates Mael, putting Avacyn Angel of Hope into play, giving all his permanents indestructible. After that, Mike is able to attack each of us with enough damage to knock us all out, specifically taking Bilal out with Infect, winning Mike the game. Alright, so that game was a little bit better than the first one. We still didn't quite get there, but we at least put up a fight this time. Obviously, let's go back and talk about the first game real quick. There's not much to say about our deck. We kept a 1-lander, we cast a single spell, and then had that spell stolen from us, so we did next to nothing. I won't say we did literally nothing, because we didn't technically do literally nothing. We did one thing, so not a great showing for our deck. Mike, on the other hand, had a very good showing in game 1. Unfortunately, casting that Pact of Negation and then forgetting about the trigger cost him the game. He did mention that that was literally the first time he had ever cast a Pact of Negation, so I guess that's a mistake that probably won't be made a second time. Cow's deck, also very cool to see it go off. It was neat to see him casting instant speed stuff that wasn't typically meant to be instant speed, being able to copy the Consecrated Sphinx. He did mention that when he was drawing so many cards with the Consecrated Sphinx, he was specifically looking for the Thought Vessel that he keeps in the deck, and he couldn't find it. Eventually it wound up being in like the bottom 10 cards of his deck. So that was why he wound up milling himself out, because he got a little bit too greedy at the end, but it was definitely worth the search, I think. And then finally, Bilal kind of flew under the radar most of that game. He started to get a little bit threatening at the end with the Halo Fountain and the Perforos, and I think that if he hadn't been interacted with, if his things hadn't been taken, he would have put up much more of a fight. And I think that if Mike had stuck around after stealing all of his cards, then Bilal probably wasn't going to win that through all of the interaction. But being able to survive so that it's just him and me, and again, me just having one land, meant that he could very easily just kind of run me over with Jetmir. So a very good showing overall by everybody. The second game was much more of an interactive game for most people. Cow, unfortunately, really got stuck on mana in the beginning. He only had blue mana for the longest time, eventually got red mana, but never found black mana. He did mention that that Thieving Skydiver that he cast was actually in his opening hand, and he expected someone to play a mana rock that he was going to be able to steal, get his colors, and keep rolling, and none of us cast a single mana rock the entire game, so he was really out of luck in that case. Again, a situation I think of keeping a good hand that could have paid off, but unfortunately wasn't quite lucky enough to have it happen. Mike's deck in that game, very, very powerful. I think the combination of Mael, Selvala, and Seedborn Muse, considering we couldn't interact with it, or when we tried to interact with it, it was dealt with, was incredibly, incredibly powerful. And I don't think Mike would have come nearly as close to winning the game if it weren't for that, considering he was stuck on 4 lands the entire game, and all of the mana he generated came from Selvala. So very cool showing from Mike's deck. Bilal's Elenda deck didn't get to do too much, unfortunately. He played a lot of support pieces like the Meathook Massacre and the Phyrexian Plague Lord, but he was never quite able to get off the ground. He couldn't really find anything to sacrifice. He just had a ton of ways to kill creatures or to deal with his own sacrificing shenanigans, but not the best showing, I don't think, for Elenda. Usually he gets Elenda out much sooner than that. And then, of course, our deck did significantly better. Game 2, turns out having mana is essential to playing the game. And I think that we really struggled when we were hit with the early board wipe from Bilal, especially because I had Kamal in my hand as early as turn 3. So if Bilal hadn't wiped my board that turn, I was going to untap, play Kamal, give all of our creatures +3/+3, and just start swinging and start knocking people out of the game. So I do think that the early board wipe really set us back and put us in a position where we weren't really set up to win. Although I do think that if Mike hadn't started to go off with Mael, Selvala, and Seedborn Muse, that we would have eventually taken control of the game, because the only reason that our creatures kept dying at that point was because of Zakama. So without Zakama, we probably would have been in a pretty commanding position. But that was the second of 2 games, and I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. Hope you enjoyed the video and both of the games, even if one of them wasn't much of a game from our perspective. I hope you still enjoyed it. If you did, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.